Continuing our conversation on the CRAP test, today we're going to really talk about this idea of relevancy, whether something is on your topic and appropriate to use for your research. And so with that, relevance, if you go back to that CRAP test video or that handout I gave you, talks about the coverage and depth of the content and its importance for your needs, addresses issues of what is the depth and coverage of the information. Really, relevance at its surface level is really about, is this on your topic, and is it providing you with the information you need to answer the questions you have? And that is the biggest component of relevance, but that's where most students stop, and you really have these other two bullet points of who is the intended audience. Is it researchers, children, consumers, etc.? And have you looked at a variety of other sources before deciding you will use this one? And these second and third bullet points are really important in determining whether a resource is appropriate to use. Relevance really doesn't deal with credibility of resources and accuracy as much as is it appropriate, and for students this would be considering, is it appropriate for academic research? Is this something you want to use in your university level paper? And so with the depth and coverage of, does it give you the information that you need? That's pretty simple to determine. Yes, this tells me the information I need and it's coming from a credible source. But really this intended audience of who is it intended to be read by does kind of throw students off sometimes. And so what we're talking about with this, sorry, I clicked ahead for a minute too. We're going to be looking at how information is created in terms of source types, but we're also going to be looking at this idea of who's the intended audience in terms of, is the resource popular, scholarly, or trade? And so within this PowerPoint, I have links to videos. I'm not going to make you watch a video within a video. So stop your PowerPoint here, or stop this video, go back to your video and instructions page and watch this video on the information life cycle. Going to give you a second to do that. Okay, everybody paused and went and watched that video. Please do so, it is important. Information life cycle really talks about how information is created and kind of the timeline in which information is presented to you, particularly in regards to the format and the source type that you're looking at. Are you looking at news and news media? Are you looking at books? Are you looking at articles? Are you looking at magazines versus peer-reviewed scholarly journals, and how does that information become available to readers and to viewers and to researchers? And so important points to take away, that the format, and what I mean by that is it a news article, is it a journal article, is it a book, etc. The format information is available to you is time sensitive. So if you are looking for books on a particular topic that happened just recently, so a good example would be COVID-19, they aren't out there yet. Information in formats such as books and peer-reviewed articles takes a lot of time to produce and publish and become available to readers. I think the video says kind of anywhere from 6 months to a year for peer-reviewed articles. I'd put that at 2 years would be a more accurate statement, so that when you're submitting articles to be published in academic journals, it takes a long time to do the research and to write it up. I would say a year minimum. Right now, I've been working on a project with a colleague for the past year, and we're still in the research phase. And so there can be a big time gap between when studies are performed versus when they actually come out in print. Part of that is the time it takes to do the research and write it up. The other part goes through the publishing process of, once you submit journal articles for publication and to be considered by the journal to be printed, there's a time delay, typically of anywhere from 3 to 6 months. Lots of academic journals only come out with 4 issues a year. So you have to think they're going to know well in advance of what's going in the next issue 6 months minimum down the road. And so you have, even once an article has been accepted, it could be 6 months to a year before it actually comes out in print and is available for researchers. So you have time sensitive. So if you're looking at really timely current issues, you might be stuck using news resources, which are more updated daily and weekly, that have a more immediate, instant ability to become public and accessible to readers. You might be kind of limited to those types of information for the very current, but then you're looking at peer-reviewed articles and books for your background and foundational knowledge. Another thing to consider is information grows and gathers as it goes through the cycle. A good metaphor for that would be snowballing. The further you get into the cycle, the more in-depth the information is going to be, where news media is going to give you very limited info. It's going to give you the facts as they know it, as it's happening. But then once you start getting into articles and books, you then have experts and other people start gathering this information together, tying it together, and analyzing it for you. So you do kind of get that depth of information the further you go into the cycle. And another thing that I like to point out from this video is that books and articles found as ebooks or in library databases are the exact same as their paper or print copies. Occasionally we have students come into the library, and I've had more students than I can count tell me this, that they're struggling because their professor said they couldn't use web resources, or they could only have one web resource. And so they're like, I have to find paper copies of these. No. If your professor is saying you can only use one web resource, what they mean is you can only use one website that you found through Google, that the only way this information is available as a website. If you're finding things through libraries' electronic resources, so either ebooks or e-journals and electronic articles, those have a print component. They are published research that they're going through the same process of review and edit and publication as their print counterparts. And so just like if you picked up your favorite book, so you picked up a copy of Harry Potter, the paperback copy that you have in your hand is going to be the same as the Kindle edition, right? It's the exact same book. It's just how you're accessing it that's different. So don't be thrown off by an e-version is different, or I can't use that in my research. So if your professor's telling you you have to use published information or you can't use web resources, library electronic resources do not count 99.9% of the time. Unless your professor says you have to go find a print book or a print journal article, they're perfectly happy with anything you're bringing out of our library's electronic databases. Professors who are telling you you have to go print, it's because they're wanting you to learn how to go find that, and we have very few professors who do that on this campus. So ebooks and e-articles are the same as their paper counterparts, and they don't count as web resources. All right, so coming into this idea of journal and periodical types. And so I'm going to talk a lot with the rest of this presentation about journal types, but these types don't just apply to journals. So I'm going to say journals because that's how things are organized really readily and what most people talk about when they talk about scholarly versus popular versus trade. These labels of scholarly and popular apply to books and to web resources as well. So anything that I'm teaching you about journals, you can then apply it to a book, you can apply it to a web resource. But what are your journal or your information types? So you get three types called scholarly, popular, and trade. And I like to start with popular because it's typically what people are most familiar with. Popular journals or magazines include magazines, newspapers, things that you're most likely to see at the checkout aisle at Walmart or the newsstand area in Barnes & Noble. These might be things you or your parents subscribe to. These are things people are most familiar with seeing. They are considered popular not because everybody loves them, but because they're intended to be read by the general public or the general population. So these are written so that anyone can pick up this magazine or newspaper, read it, and understand it. Keep in mind, most newspapers within the United States are written at a 6th grade reading level. 6th grade reading level is the average reading level of the American adult. And so they're written at this easy to understand reading level so that any American adult can pick it up and read it. They're meant to reach the widest audience possible. Popular resources, whether they're magazines, newspapers, even books and websites, are sometimes pretty easy to identify on sight because they look eye-catching. They have a very colorful appearance, glossy covers, lots of photos, large text. These are meant to catch your eye and make you want to pick them up and read them. Even if you're looking at them electronically in the library's databases, they're still going to be very colorful on the screen and very eye-catching, having these large photos. So like I said, they're written for the general public. Their purpose is to either entertain or provide news. So these are not typically providing you with academic research. It can be providing you with news and updates of what's going on in the world today, what's going on in a specific section or topic. These resources can be educational. So for example, I have National Geographic down here as an example of a popular magazine because it is educational. It does talk about science, but it's written for the general public. So who is this intended to be read by is kind of what you're considering with this popular. Its purpose is to Entertain and educate is providing you with news about science topics kind of for your entertainment. This is something people are reading this because they're interested in it, not because they're doing original research though. So very simple, easy to understand language. Typically the authors are going to be journalists or professional writers. This article on wild pets in National Geographic was written by a person who is a professional writer on the topic of science, is probably hired regularly by National Geographic. It's not written by expert researchers within the field. Newspapers articles are written by professional journalists. These are people who their entire career is writing. It's not written by the person on the ground who's doing the research. So even if they're reporting someone else's research, they're writing it so that they're taking someone else's knowledge and writing it so it's accessible to the average reader. So typically with this, what you're not going to see within them, even if they're credible resources and accurate and sometimes appropriate to use in research, you're not going to see sources or bibliographies. You're never going to see citations in these type of resources, even when they are educational like National Geographic or Newsweek or something like that, that is not just frivolous entertainment like People is. You're not going to see citations. However, credible sources, they aren't going to provide you with citations, but they're going to provide you with what I call in-text sources. So remember how earlier this week we talked about how to find and identify sources within the text, that they use signal phrases according to so-and-so, or John Smith of the Institute of blah, blah, blah said this. That's to where they're giving you where they're getting their information in the actual paragraphs and in the writing in the text. And so that is then providing you with some credibility of information that they're providing you with. And you could then go search for that person or search for that research article if they're mentioning something and look it up and read the original article yourself. So credible people will tell you in the text where they're getting their info with those signal phrases. By crediting someone else said this, they are going to provide you with that for accuracy. If you're not seeing that, if they're making claims that they're not telling you where they're getting their info, that should be a red flag of credibility. That should be a red flag for your accuracy section of if they're not telling you at all where they're getting their info. All right, so that is popular. Fun, bright, colorful, meant for the general public, meant to entertain, provide news, can be educational, but is still kind of entertainment educational. When to use popular journals. Typically, you do want to use these sparingly within your research. You want to find where the original information came from, or you need to support it with scholarly research. You do want to use popular, though, when you need very current info, and that's really tying to newspapers. Newspapers can be great sources of information. You want to make sure you're using a credible and accurate newspaper, not some scandalous news rag that you see as kind of more sensationalism and stuff like Elvis is alive and the alien stole my baby kind of newspapers. But we do want credible people who are giving you accurate info. And so sometimes that's the best source to find that information when it's very, very current, very up to date, like we talked about with that information cycle. When you need current opinions on social issues, that is newspaper editorials. So newspapers are considered popular because they are for the general public, meant to be read by and understood by anyone, but you do still want to use them sparingly, although they are appropriate to use. You can also use this to gather basic background information on a topic or to brainstorm ideas for a research paper. So lots of times when you're doing scholarly level research, we're going to talk about that next, scholarly research is very in-depth. You need to have some knowledge of what it is you're reading before you can understand it. It's not written for the general person on the street. So sometimes educational popular journals are more at the average person's reading level and more accessible and easy to understand. So if you're needing to kind of gather research topic ideas or gather background information on what your topic is, sometimes popular resources can be a good source for that. All right, so moving to the opposite end of the spectrum with scholarly journals. So where popular looks fun and entertaining and is very eye-catching, scholarly journals and scholarly articles look boring. I don't have a way to sugarcoat that, but they have a very somber appearance, small text, little color, few graphics. Where popular magazines, you'll see like entire pages devoted to pictures and things like that. You typically don't see that in scholarly journals. If you're getting images, you're going to get charts and diagrams that are explaining the text. You're not getting a picture of the scientist in the lab working with his rats. It's typically not what they're trying to provide you with this article. You're going to get a diagram explaining what he's doing to his rat kind of deal, not just a picture of him for prettiness. The purpose of scholarly journals is to share new and original scholarly and academic research. So this is what their entire purpose is to share this original new research that experts are doing. So they are written by scholars and experts. So the people writing these articles have credentials, like they work at universities, they work in research fields, they know exactly what they're doing with this topic, and they have a lot of background knowledge on it. And they're intended to be read by other scholars, experts, and researchers. Since you are a student at a university, you are now a scholar. So these are intended to be read and used by people like you. Keep in mind, though, like I said, sometimes you need to know a little bit about your topic before you can really dig into this. So my background is in library and information science. I have a master's degree in it. That's where my expertise lies. I probably can't pick up the American Journal of Psychotherapy that I have down here and fully understand every article. I took one psychology class my sophomore year of college, and that was it. I'm not an expert in psychotherapy. But someone who is taking more advanced psychology classes at UNCP should be able to pick up an article that on the topic they're researching and understand it. Even if it's presenting you with new language and terms that you don't understand, you should be able to say, okay, I need to go look up what that term is, take the knowledge of what that vocabulary term is, put it into your brain, and then continue on reading the article and understanding it. So they do have highly technical language, uses subject-specific jargons and terms. They're always going to provide you with a list of sources, works cited, references, bibliography, something like that. So you're going to see citations throughout the article, and you're going to have typically a full page of a work cited at the end. If you're not seeing that, you're not seeing a scholarly research article. Another thing that's very common with many scholarly articles is they have kind of a set format. And what I mean by that, you have very commonly seen subheadings of the article, that the article is going to start with an abstract that tells you here's a complete summary of what is in this research article and what we discovered. You're typically going to then move into an introduction section where they're saying here's what we're setting out to do and why we decided to do this, and kind of explaining their goals. Sometimes you then move into a literature review section. Occasionally this is called a literature review. Other times it's giving other subheadings that are more specific to the topic it's looking at, but what it's doing is providing you background knowledge of what is this topic, what are the baselines of it, what have other researchers done on this subject before I got here, and so you're kind of giving that background knowledge. Next, you move into a methods or methodology section where they're telling you, I'm going to do this study by using this specific method and this specific tool, so they're going to explain to you exactly what they're going to do and how they're going to do it. You typically then have a results section where they tell you the results of what their study or experiment was. Other times you then have a discussion or conclusion section where they take the results and explain to you what they mean. So they're telling you that I did this study on rats examining this concept, and this is the results of that, and then their conclusion section is going to explain what that means, and what we're taking away from that is this. Typically, you then kind of wrap up with possibly a conclusions or a for further discussion, and then you kind of close out with their bibliography, references, works cited. So it's very common, particularly in STEM fields and quite a few social science fields like psychology, like sociology, like criminal justice, to see those subheadings. You do see them in education and humanities fields as well. They're sometimes not as strict, particularly methodology with that. But even if they don't have those subheadings, these original research articles tend to follow that format of I'm going to give you a summary of the entire article. I'm going to give you an intro section where I'm explaining what I'm going to do. I'm going to tell you what was done in the background of the topic. I'm going to tell you what it is I'm doing and how exactly I'm going to do it. I'm going to tell you the results of what I did. I'm going to tell you what those results mean, and then I'm going to give you my sources. So you kind of follow that basic flow. So even if they don't have those specific subheadings of lit review, methodology, results, discussion, etc., they're kind of following that same sort of pattern. So when you see that, that is a really good indicator that it's a scholarly journal. It's a really good indicator. It is primary original research, which is research where the person writing the article did the research and did the study themselves. So seeing that, those are good indicators of scholarly. Another thing you see with scholarly is peer review. And I've kept on saying this term throughout the class. We're really going to discuss exactly what is peer review today. So peer review is a process by which an academic journal passes a paper submitted for publication to independent, anonymous experts for comments on its suitability and worth, also called refereeing. All right, I got an in-depth video. I do want you once again to pause and watch. So pause this video, go watch this other one from NC State on peer reviewed. I linked it below this one. Take a second and watch that. So go do that. All right, everybody went and watched? Good job. The reason I like to give students this video, my experience of students understanding a peer reviewed. At best, they know that it means it was reviewed by other experts before it was published, and my professor requires me to use it. And that's all they know about peer review. This video kind of goes more in depth explaining the complete process of peer review and the benefit it adds to academic research. It's a way of vetting information before it goes into publication, so only the most accurate and credible info actually goes into that scholarly conversation we're talking about, so you're not getting bad information out there. It is an imperfect process. Sometimes you do get bad information passing through a peer-reviewed process. A very good example was a study that proved vaccines called autism. It's called autism. I'm sure y'all have all heard of this. You've heard of the whole vaccination debate. That study was published in a peer-reviewed journal and has since then been thoroughly disproven. They're saying, yeah, no, we don't know how you got past your peer-review process. This is completely inaccurate. And so peer-reviewed is a measure. Typically, you don't have as big of mistakes as that, but it is a measure of adding to that scholarly conversation of making sure the information meets the standards of quality and rigor of its field that it's in. So if you're publishing something in a criminal justice journal, it's going to be other criminal justice experts reviewing this to make sure, okay, you're doing things correctly with your study. And so we're going to accept the findings that you're doing, that you're not, it's not just a proofreading edit that's looking for how did you write the article and do you have any grammatical errors. They're taking a look at where did you get your information? How did you do your research? Make sure you're not doing step A, B, and C and getting result Z way out in left field. And is it original, that you're not just regurgitating someone else's info? So peer review is important. It is important for academic research because it's making you meet the standard of your peers. It's making you play by the rules of the game that is academic research. And so it is really important. Things to consider with peer review, students also don't understand. When you're looking at peer review in library resources, peer review is a label for journals, not articles. It's the entire journal itself that's going to be labeled peer reviewed. On a side note, academic books can't, particularly scholarly books, can go through a peer reviewed process, but they're not going to be labeled as peer reviewed. It's not as standardized as journals go through, and so it kind of varies publisher to publisher, and so they can go through a peer review process, but they're not going to be labeled as such. So if you're limiting within library resources, you're only going to get articles. You're going to be knocking out anything that's newspapers, that's books, so keep that in mind. It's going to bring you a very specific type of resource if you're limiting to that. We're going to show you kind of what that looks like in the video following this. Also, not everything in a peer-reviewed journal goes through a peer-reviewed process, and I'm going to talk about that more in the video as well. So watch the follow-up video. That's much shorter than this one as well. So peer-reviewed, important. Only scholarly journals are going to be labeled as peer-reviewed. And so it's a good indicator of scholarly academic research. If your professor is requiring you to use this info, this is a label you do need to look at. How to determine peer review, like I said, we're going to go through that in the video. Limit within the database or Primo search to scholarly peer reviewed only. You can, if you're unsure, also look at the journal description. If you're looking at an article and you're like, I don't know if this was peer reviewed, you want to look at the info for the journal it's coming out of. And then when in doubt, Google it. So video after this is going to show that to you. All right, finally, your third journal book information type is what we call trade journals, and this confuses everybody. Trade journals is a little bit difficult to determine just by looking at it. Whereas popular and scholarly, you can take a look at this article and I can typically tell you right off the bat, just by looking at the first page, which it is. Trade, you have to go a little bit deeper and consider what is the purpose of it, not just how does it look. So reason for that, trade journals kind of sit in the middle between popular and scholarly, have a very colorful appearance that you're getting these glossy covers and big text. You're going to get pictures throughout the articles themselves. The purpose of a trade journal, though, is not to entertain or provide news. It's not to present original research, but is to improve job performance within a particular field or to update on developments or news and new updates in particular professions or trades or jobs. So, for example, if you work in aviation, you are a pilot or you are a technician who works on planes or something like that, you might read Aviation Week in Space Technology to learn about that. If you work in banking, you might read Global Finance. This is something that the average person could probably pick this up and read it, but they wouldn't want to. I actually worked for a library that subscribed to Sheep Monthly. I always looked at the covers. I'm not a sheep farmer, so I never actually looked at the articles within it. So keep that in mind. I'm sorry, I'm trying to get rid of these things down here. Okay, go away. So with that, if you don't work in this profession, you probably won't want to look at it. So written by professionals in a specific field for people who work in that field, typically doesn't contain sources or bibliographies. You're not typically seeing citations within them. If it's more academic field-minded, you might see 1 or 2 citations at the end of the article, but you're not going to see like a whole page. Also, these articles are typically shorter, to whereas popular magazines, their feature articles are going to be anywhere from 2, 4, or 5 pages maybe. Scholarly peer-reviewed journals, 10 plus pages minimum for a peer-reviewed article that is doing this primary original research. Because they're telling you every step of how they did that research, they're lengthy articles. 10 pages is actually on the shorter side. These are going to be more like popular length, that they're 2 to 5 pages ish, but when they can contain those sources if they're more academic, education minded. So like I read a magazine called Library Journal, which is published by the American Library Association. And so sometimes their feature articles, they will cite within it where they're getting their sources. But like I said, a few citations at the end, not a whole page. Many of these also, if you're looking at who owns them, who is publishing them, you see professional organizations like the American Library Association, professional associations for teachers, for criminal justice majors, for people who work and produce music or within films or studies or things like that, that you're seeing these professional organizations that people become a member of. It's kind of clubs and professional development and stuff. Lots of times they're the ones producing these type of trade journals. And so they're going to use jargon, but have a much less formal tone. I'd say the difference between this and scholarly research is very, very formal, very academic. We're pulling out all of our big words. If you go back to the beginning of the course, remember how I had you read those ALA documents for standards and frameworks with very, very formal and fancy language. That's kind of scholarly research. This is something they're going to use jargon, but this is less I am standing up and presenting this before my colleagues and I'm just talking to my friend who works in my office. So you're going to be using jargon and language that you need to work in the field to probably understand, but much less formal, casual tone, so you're talking to your friend or your colleague about it. Okay, so biggest consideration when you're looking at popular versus scholarly versus trade, when you're considering this for journals or books, other info, biggest consideration in determining is what is the intent of the magazine or journal and what's its purpose. So who is this intended to be read by? Is this intended to be read by scholars? Is this intended to be read by the general public? It's just someone who's interested in it. Is it intended for people who work in a particular job? What are you getting out of it? Are you getting kind of that news and updates? Are you getting that job training? Are you getting that original research? So what is the intent of who it's intended to be read by and why? And what type of info is it giving you? Is it giving you that research, news, entertainment, updates? So those are the two biggest things to consider when determining is something scholarly versus popular versus trade. Everything else when determining this of the authors that are writing it, who's publishing it, particularly for books, like it comes from a scholarly publishing house versus a popular publishing house. We're going to talk about that in another video too. Everything else kind of surrounding that is evidence for why you think it's popular versus scholarly, but that intent is the biggest one. Who is this intended to be read by is the biggest indicator of what the information is. Because you can have professional researchers who work at universities could write an article for a popular magazine. They could write an article for a trade magazine. So just because they are a PhD working in neuroscience doesn't mean the article is necessarily scholarly. It's scholarly when it's presenting original research. It's popular when it's intended to be read by the general public to entertain or educate or provide news. It's trade when it's intended to improve your job performance within a particular thing. So that's what I'm considering with that. The flip side of that is typically journalists are not going to be producing, who are professional writers, aren't going to be publishing in scholarly journals. Scholarly is kind of expert only. And so if you're seeing someone that doesn't have credentials that they're listing who they are and they work at this university or something like that, that's something to consider about, okay, maybe this isn't scholarly. They're just not going to publish Joe Smith off the street who can't prove I know what I'm talking about with that. So keep that in mind with those. And to determine this, you need to bring out your inner Sherlock. You need to do a little bit of investigating of what is the journal or what is the book itself. You need to be looking at details of what type of info is it bringing you to, and put on those critical thinking caps. And sometimes you need to Google it of what is this journal, what is this publishing house, of where the information is coming from. If it's a website, what is the organization of, look at their about section and who are they and what do they do kind of deal. So critical thinking, this isn't all just surface level assessment with that. So keep in mind.